This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is all about web APIs. In fact, it is titled Web APIs That Every JavaScript Developer Should Know. So in this episode that Mike actually put together this week, we're going to be talking about things like the DOM API that allows JavaScript to interact with and manipulate HTML and CSS. We're also going to be talking about fetch. We're going to be talking about storage, like local storage and session storage and IndexedDB. We're going to be talking about service worker APIs and a whole bunch more. I'm not going to list them all. I don't want to spoil the episode, I suppose. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. Now, Mike, like I said, you wrote this episode, so why don't you start off by letting us know what web APIs are out of the gate? Because I'm sure some people are going to be like, what in the heck is that?
Yeah, and honestly, sometimes this confuses me too. Like, what do you consider the web API and what do you consider JavaScript? That line and separation is, I think, the thing that I want to focus on most in this episode, because I think that's what makes it easier for people to find the right API, first of all, that they need to use. Like, we're not going to be able to teach you how to use APIs on a podcast. I'm sorry to say that. Like, it's just, this is not a video podcast, first of all, not yet. This is a podcast meant to just talk about the industry, and it's not meant to teach you the intricacies of every coding API that's available. So the point that I want to make is like, hey, these APIs exist. They're not part of JavaScript. They're part of the browser, right? That's what allows them to be web APIs. And for you to just kind of demystify the part where you think they are super complicated and you should avoid using them and stuff like that. Like, these are meant to make your life easier as developers. It's meant to make a better feature-rich product for your end user. So you should be relying on them as much as possible when you are. And a lot of times, if you're using a framework, it's already relying heavily on web APIs in the background. So you're already using them, even if you don't know that you're using them. So that's what I want to kind of cover. What are they? Well, web APIs are sets of methods and properties in JavaScript that allow you to interact with directly to the user browser, right? So these are web APIs that are exposed by the browsers themselves. So like Safari, Chrome, all the JavaScript engines have their own kind of implementation of the web API, but how they expose it is aligned across all browsers pretty much. There are some edge cases like, some new APIs. I believe there's an API for doing VR and virtual reality and like augmented reality in the web. That is still kind of experimental. Therefore, there might be differences between each browser implementing it. When it's an experimental stage, just expect there to be jankiness across browsers. Some browsers won't support it at all until it gets into like final stages. So, but the ones that we're going to be mainly talking about, like the essentials, the ones that you need to know, are obviously part of the browser in every browser in every shape or form. So you don't have to worry about cross-browser compatibility. Why do they matter? Again, they help you make the web feel more like a native application. You're able to do much more if you leverage these APIs versus trying to build like a janky solution without them that does the same thing. Like, you could do fetching in a different way, or you could, manipulate the browser content in a different way by like switching the page on page loads or something. Like, I'll talk about that a little bit, but there's ways around using every single one of these APIs. But why is my question. Like, you shouldn't go around them. You should learn them. You should embrace them because they make your life easier. Now, having said that, let's get on to the essentials. Really, the essentials consist of 3 APIs. One, some people might not even consider an API, but it definitely is because it's an exposed property of the browser, the DOM API. I think a lot of people, when they learn JavaScript, they learn DOM manipulation, right? And they consider that to be part of JavaScript versus part of the browser, which it isn't, right? Like, yes, JavaScript is a browser language, right? Like that's the language that runs in the browser. But if you try to use DOM manipulation outside of front-end web development, like the front end in the browser, and try to do it in like Node.js, for example, you're going to get some issues. You're going to have some serious issues because there's no DOM. There's no DOM in Node.js. There's no document object model in Node.js. Therefore, this is a particularly strong web API. And that's the separation there. It's like, yes, it's part of JavaScript, but it's part of JavaScript on the web, not just the JavaScript core part of the language. So what is the DOM object model? It allows JavaScript to interact with and manipulate HTML and CSS elements dynamically. You can create dynamic user experiences using the DOM API. Some key functions are stuff like query selector, get element by ID, create element, inner HTML, like changing inner HTML, appending a child, removing a child. A lot of stuff that you would be doing if you're not going to be leveraging a framework, for instance. So a lot of times, if you're going to be using React or Svelte, these frameworks actually replace most of your interaction with the DOM with an abstraction layer on top of that interaction, making it easier for you to do stuff like getting elements by IDs and creating elements and all that fun stuff that the DOM API exposes. Again, why you need to use these? Well, if you want to make an interactive website, if you want a website where the page isn't static, so when you click a button, something changes on that page dynamically and shows something new, that requires manipulating the DOM. So if you're doing stuff like an e-commerce product page that, you need to update the DOM if dynamically the price is changing, or if you're looking at a stock counter that you want to automatically update if someone from, someone else buys it and you want people to see that dynamically on the page. If you want, you click something to add to cart and it'll, actually add to cart without refreshing the page and stuff like that. Like, that's all DOM manipulation, right? If you're doing a web app, especially a to-do list, think about that. Add a to-do, remove a to-do, all of that is removing, creating, and managing elements on a web page. That's heavy, heavy DOM manipulation.
A big thing, too, here that I see right away is obviously addressing things. So someone who kind of more so leans toward the front end of development stuff, the DOM API really kind of is all about the query selector, the get element and get element by ID. Other ones, of course, Mike already mentioned a few, but these ones are going to be really paramount and honestly are probably one of the first two methods that you'll learn in JavaScript just in general. Because typically you'll type into a Google search or something along the lines of, how do I, dynamically hide and show this? How do I move this away? If, the number one appears, how do I make this other thing disappear? But then I want to make it appear whenever it's, an even number or something like that. That'll all be done by some JavaScript logic, but then also addressing the thing you're trying to show and hide, addressing the elements that you're trying to move around. And, get elements by class name is another one as well. If you're trying to manipulate sort of en masse CSS, that's rather common. And also these two methods are going to be used a lot when you're dealing with quick fixes on things that are very buried. So something like a WordPress or another editor like it, where the thing you're seeing on the screen needs to be manipulated slightly, and you need to do a quick Band-Aid fix, or the controls that are given to you by, let's say, a WordPress plugin or something along those lines doesn't give you the ability to make that little tiny visual tweak. Oftentimes you'll take the finished product, go and check what ID it is, what class it is, what type of element it is, and you'll address it with one of these, query selector or get element by ID, and then you'll do something to it, right? Like you'll go in and you'll say, hey, this, like the element that has the ID proceed, which is probably like a proceed button, we want the proceed button on hover to be green, and we want it once it's clicked to be red or something like that. Something that maybe the editor you're using doesn't allow. Now, some people will argue that you should be doing that in a plugin, but in the real world, sometimes those things come down at the 11th hour, and you'll be doing a little bit of, quick CSS and quick JS, just sort of on the side to quickly patch things up. And those two selectors really stand out to me as something that you'll use a lot. And the other ones you'll use a bunch too, like creating elements, appending child, remove child, things like that. You'll start getting into. But query selector and get element by ID for probably the first 6 to 8 months that I was working with JavaScript. Actually, to be honest, probably get element by ID and get class name, get elements by class name. Those two were probably the biggest ones that I used when we were getting started for probably 6 to 8 months. And then I started learning other ones once my needs started to change and once my learning continued.
I think mainly because query selector was still in experimental mode or something like that when we were starting out. Query selector has taken over almost both of those at this point because it's so much more like not adjustable, but it's so much. There's so much more you can do with it now. It's more robust. It's more robust. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's way more robust than what we had before, but it just wasn't available when we were learning.
Well, actually,
JavaScript at a
that's something you and I can discuss though. Is like I do agree with you. Like I think it was experimental, but. So if I'm addressing something by ID, I still use the get element by ID because I think it's easier to read. Now, I understand that query selector is pretty dang easy to read, but when I see like get element by ID and then the ID, I just like immediately know it's an ID. That might just be due to my familiarity. I absolutely can use a query selector to select an ID, and I have done it, obviously. But I don't know what you think about that. Like, do you think that I should be replacing all my elements by class name and all my element by ID with query, or do you think it really matters?
Yeah, I think it more replaces get elements by class name. I don't know why, but I've seen that the query selector just returns a better object than get elements by class name, and it's just easier to reference many. I could be wrong on that, honestly. Like I'm sure get elements by class name pretty much is identical if you're referencing by class name. It's just you can add more conditions to the query selector where it's going to be like not only is it class name, but it's only like images with class name of this. Which is, I think, a pretty powerful addition to the just by class name. So that's why I've seen it being used much more often versus just class name. You're right, though. Get element by ID is much more clear when you're just looking to get one single element by a single ID, and that's all you're looking to do. So I think I've seen that still used pretty heavily.
I will say my get elements by class name has basically been replaced by query selector. It just seems to make a nicer... I'm not even sure like the technical part of it. Honestly, it just sort of naturally happened over time because I haven't really thought about it, to be honest. But like using sort of, I guess, the old way, back when query selector was experimental or wasn't widely used, and I was using get elements by class name, it was a lot of like get elements by class name, put them in a variable. Now that variable is an array. Now you had to go into the array. Well, is it the first one? Is it the second one? Is it the third one? It just feels like query selector is just a lot kind of better at doing that myself. I just find it to be a lot better. And like you said, like you can say like, hey, like give me all the, featured images, and featured images are, tagged with, this class and this ID or whatever the combination is. So yeah, like my get elements by class name has absolutely been pretty well replaced by query selector. I still like my get element by ID.
Yeah, I think the only other one that I use en masse that I haven't mentioned here is DOM content loaded, which is the lifecycle method for detecting when your actual page has been loaded. Like your content on the page is now available to be interacted with. In JavaScript, you could check that using a DOM content loaded event and then do whatever you need to do after stuff has been loaded. That's a very common one where you might want to append something dynamically or check if something exists and manipulate it or whatever. Like a lot of these query selectors, get element by IDs are usually wrapped in a DOM content loaded, because if you're just checking for an element and it hasn't even been populated yet in the browser, it's going to throw an error. So just clear. There's more lifecycle elements, by the way, in the DOM that you can learn, but DOM content loaded is definitely the most popular and I guess the most like heavily used one.
I do want to add one thing that I actually did forget is there's also the query selector all. And that's actually the one that's closer to get elements by class name. So like I said, get elements by class name returns an array of all the items or all the elements, that have the CSS class applied that you've decided to select. Whereas query selector, as far as I understand it, will only return the first of something, which is extremely helpful because oftentimes people that do the CSS will use a class rather than an ID to be a bit more robust. And then what happens is you'll want to select the item by, like, it'll be a unique item on the page, but it won't have an ID affiliated with it. It won't be a unique element type. It'll literally just be like, dot featured. And you're like, oh, shoot, now I got to use dot elements by class name, if it's an array, and I got to address the first one. And it's relatively easy, But this is just the next step where you're just like, give me a query selector and then, give me the first class you find. Because on this page, we only care about the first one, or maybe there literally only is one. But if there are a lot, then you go, okay, you have a kind of a choice when you're selecting a group of classes. You can do get elements by class name, or you can do query selector all. So I wanted to clarify that.
Yep, absolutely. That was a good clarification. I was referring more to query selector all when I was referencing query selector, so my bad. To be clear, I'm very much a heavy framework user at this point. I still rely on some of these when in edge casey stuff. Like today I even use an append child and a create element, even though I'm using Svelte. There's just this little edge casey things that still you have to rely on some of these DOM content APIs, but overall, 99% of all of my manipulation of DOM is handled by the framework. Okay, next one here is the fetch API. So this one is actually a fairly recent one that was added to the browser, where before we were using stuff like AJAX and XML HTTP requests to do any sort of data fetching straight from the browser. So it was nice when they added in the fetch API, because the fetch API is kind of standard across many, many different frameworks, many, many different backends. And now we're able to use and utilize that same kind of async await methods of fetching something, putting it into data, getting the JSON from that data, and then showing it on the page. And again, you would probably take that data and maybe use one of those DOM methods that I was talking about to, iterate over and create a bunch of elements and then append child to a bunch of elements. If you're doing something dynamic like displaying movies from a data API, from a movie data API, right? Like you would query the data, return that data, transfer it, convert it into JSON, and then that JSON would be in an array form. You would iterate over that array on every iteration with a for loop. You would create an element, add whatever styling you want to that element, whatever class name you want to that element, and then append that child to some sort of body or some sort of parent element, something like that. And you can get that parent element with like a query selector or query selector. So it's all kind of intertwined together. And fetch API, again, just an easy way for you to fetch. One clarification I do want to make, again, this is the front end. So when you're using the fetch API in the front end, do not use secure API keys to fetch something, because if you're using a secure API key on the front end to fetch something that you don't want to be leaked, like something like an open API key, for instance, that everyone's building with open API. If you use an open API key on your front end application to do anything, and you deploy that app to the web, someone will be able to go into your code and literally steal your API key. You want to do any sort of actual secure data API stuff on a back end, and that's different. And again, there is fetch on the back end, but it's implemented differently. You can use it the same way, but it's not the browser exposing it. It is like Node.js exposing it, or Dino exposing it, or Bun, whatever backend framework you use for JavaScript is exposing their own fetch API. This is the browser fetch API, where you're just kind of consuming publicly available data. Let's call it that.
And a lot of that, I was going to say a lot of those sort of insecure APIs, if you will, are usually things like, how much do like V-Bucks cost? If you had like a gaming API where it's like, that's not secure information. Like no one's gonna be like, yo man, like no one should know this, but if you log into the PlayStation Store, it'll be there. It's like, well, that's public information. And so like we've absolutely, like Mike, like you and I have, either with fetch or with other methods as well, like we've used outdated methods to like, use grab information, store information. And people will be like, yo, that's insecure. And it's like, right, but it's all public. So like someone breaks in and goes, haha, I have your database that is literally displayed nice in a nicer format on your, in its entirety on your website. It's like, good catch, bud.
Yeah, exactly. And most of these public APIs, I want to be clear, have their own security on their end, where you can't like continually hit them and pull infinite information from them. They'll rate limit you. So that's their security. If you refresh the site 5 million times, you're probably going to end up with an error. If you want to catch that error, that's another example of where you can use something like an async await with a error catch, like a try catch method. If something goes wrong with the fetch, then you can display a nice error message. That is a very standard pattern with using fetch APIs, a try catch. Not that I really like it that much. I feel like there's better solutions than a try catch. I feel like in web development especially, we rely on the try catch way too much, but it does work and it's a standard method. Next thing here Probably one of the biggest ones is the storage APIs. So there is local storage, session storage, and IndexedDB, right? Those three are used for three very different things. What do they do? Well, they allow you to store data on the client side and retrieve it after you reload a page or close a page, right? Depending on what it is. Like session storage is a little bit different because when you close a page and reopen it, you're technically creating a new session. It's blank. I'll talk about that in a second. Local storage is probably the one that most reflects that definition, where if you store something in local storage and the person reopens that browser on the same computer and reopens that page that you have, if it's already stored in local storage, you can retrieve that data and use it as if the person was already like in the middle of a whatever they were doing, like you can return their preferences like dark mode, light mode. A lot of people store that into local storage. You can return the state that they were in. Maybe they were like, in the middle of completing a form. So you can put that into local storage and stuff like that, all the information that they were in the middle of completing. There's a lot of use cases for like just holding that data in some sort of way. If they were to go on a different computer and open that page, that would not transfer from local storage to local storage. That would need to be handled by a logged in user with a database, right? You can't really get around that. That's a sync. That's something that can't be handled in a regular storage API in the web browser.
Well, we have the upcoming, golf tracker app, and one of the things is going to be, obviously it's going to be a web app. It's also going to be some sort of mobile app, whether it's just a mobile site or whatever. We haven't, figured all that out yet. However, one of the big features is it must work online. Like it needs to be simple and it must work offline, right? And so, like the storage would be something, I would assume, probably local storage, and then it would eventually, if we add, syncing, it would then sync to some sort of database that's up in the cloud that's affiliated with a user account if or when we add that feature. And so like this was actually a huge feature for us, like just storing things in general, because we were doing Chrome apps for a long time, as we've said on the show several times. And one of the big problems is they were, more or less glorified web apps with a few different APIs for, Google specific things that you could do with Chrome and in the Chromebook and that type of thing. And one of the things that kind of sucked was it was like, where the heck do we store this stuff, right? Like we built a game. It's like, well, we can't have the person constantly restarting their game. So it's like, where does it go, right? And then we also had an issue too where, sometimes it's like, okay, well, it's local storage for a reason, but maybe, someone has built a big list and they want this elsewhere. Like, where do we put it? And so we had another Chrome extension actually called List by Design. And we added the ability, actually upon request, we added the ability to extract that data. And so the reason why I mention this stuff is that, obviously it's not talking specifically about, how these things work too much, but this is where you kind of get into the weeds, right? Is as you start adding complexity to your JavaScript knowledge, you'll eventually come to a point where it's like, hey, the user has actually done a lot for me here. They've entered in a lot of data. Maybe they've played a game for quite a while. We need this data to be stored, somewhere, and like where, right? And what's appropriate, right? If something is only for the session, then it's only for the session. If something needs to be in local, okay, great, but there's going to be limitations on that. And so storage becomes a big, big question. Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes.
That's exactly it. And like, it's a very important part of your journey to get to the storage APIs and start playing around with it, because that's when you start to get into like app territory. Now you're creating something more persistent. Now you're creating something dynamic. So this part, I wouldn't say is complicated, especially if you're going with something like local storage and session storage. That's just like storing a string and then parsing that string. It's a very simple key value store, essentially, right? Like you have a key that is what you call it, like theme, for instance, that's the key, and then the value would be dark, right? So that's the kind of complexity you can expect with a simple implementation of local storage. It does get a little bit more complex if you're storing like an object where you have multiple keys inside that object, as well as the key that references that object. that is still stored as a string inside of local storage. So you have to actually do a JSON parse, JSON stringify back and forth on the JavaScript side to be able to do that. It's still doable, but it gets a little bit more complex. That's where you need to start looking at a more complex implementation like IndexedDB. Now, I don't have a ton of experience with IndexedDB, but that's something that I will be very heavily looking into with the app that Matt was just mentioning, the Golf Tracker app, because IndexedDB allows you to store more complex data objects like pretty much a database would, like a MySQL database. It's a relational database. You're able to store you're able to use a schema. You're able to put that and have more complex objects being stored, as well as a much bigger storage limit. Now, the storage limit could be like hundreds of megs to gigs on IndexedDB, right? So like that, it does vary between browsers and between implementations. But for an example, the storage limit on local storage is only 5 megs. So if you're thinking about storing like base 64 images or a big data set inside of local storage, you're out of luck. There is no way you can do that. That's where you have to either, again, use a traditional database with the backend, or you're looking at IndexedDB and interfacing with that a little bit more. And that's totally a viable option, especially if you're making an offline first application, which very much leverages as something like IndexedDB. Now, there's stuff you can put on top of IndexedDB, which is really cool. SQLite, which is like an SQL database that's in a file storage. There's a supported version with IndexedDB implementation in the background. That's super cool because then you're using literally SQL queries to query IndexedDB, and that makes it a little bit easier to like migrate over to a database later on and stuff like that. So it's just, there's a lot of stuff you can do in this space that is very varied depending on use case, I should say, right? I would start with something like local storage, and then as soon as you grow out of it, then you'll know that, hey, that's when I need to go to something like IndexedDB, or potentially attaching a backend to it. One thing here that we haven't mentioned is also cookies. Cookies is also handled by browser APIs. Obviously, you'll be dealing with them a lot if you're doing any sort of analytics stuff, or if you're storing stuff between sessions, between browsers, between like websites. They can be kind of cross-site cookies. You have to be a little bit careful here because, again, if someone has a blocker, like an ad blocker, that specifically targets cookies. So if you're relying on cookies too much, it could actually break your app for people with ad blockers. There's little ways around that, but just to be careful.
Well, there's something to be said as well, where like allegedly I keep hearing like cookies are old and they're going to go away soon, right? There's cookieless tracking. I feel like I've been hearing this for 5 years, and I mean we're still using cookies, so it's weird. It's like when you talk about cookies, I automatically be like, oh man, this is kind of antiquated. But it's at the same time, it's like, yeah, but antiquated, but still the most relevant right now for analytics stuff, especially. So, well, I mean, we'll see what happens with cookies coming down the line, or moving down the line, as I think it's Google or Chrome or who knows at this point wants to implement cookieless tracking and cookieless this and cookieless that. We'll see what happens to cookies, but I mean, at least for the time being, right now, cookies are still very, very relevant.
Yeah, 100% relevant. And there's nothing really that bad about them either. Again, it's kind of very similar to local storage as a key value store. You're not going to be storing objects in cookies. You're going to be storing literal string values, and that's it. Very, utilitarian method of keeping track of a state of your application, but it works. And I don't think there's anything that wrong with it, as long as you're not like exploiting people. Next part of this conversation is more user experience boosting APIs rather than like the core valuable APIs. So this one, we're going to start with geolocation API. So this is built into the browser and allows you to get a person's current position using the navigator.geolocation.current position method. There's other methods in that like geolocation, but that's kind of the core one that you'd want to use. It's just an easy way to track a person's location if you need that information. Now, browsers are definitely aware that this is a privacy concern, so they're not going to just enable it by default. What they're going to do is if you're requesting someone's geolocation, they will show this little pop-up, I'm sure you've seen it, that shows, hey, this website needs to know your location. Do you want to grant that to them or not? And it's the user's choice at that point. You can't force them. It's the user's choice at that point to grant it or decline it. And that's a big differentiator between these user experience boosting APIs There's a few of them out there, like there's the multimedia API, Get User Media, that does the same thing with the microphone and the webcam. With the geolocation API, again, because it's a privacy concern, it's going to give that choice to the user. So if you're making an app that relies on a user's location, you're going to have to consider the very real possibility of someone denying their location to you and what you're going to do about that. Are you going to just show a screen that says, hey, we can't let you use the app? Are you going to give them a cut down experience? Are you going to, I don't know, call them a bad name? You have to choose an experience for the non-giving of data person, right? That's just part of this web app experience, and there's nothing you can do about that. But these, this location API is really nice if you're going to create an app for like Uber, right? Or like any app that, a restaurant locator or something like that. Like if you're just showing a user how they can get from their location to your restaurant, and you want to do that in your app for whatever reason, you can do that with the geolocation API without any sort of extra third-party libraries or whatever. Like you just, import the Google Maps API, import geolocation API, boom, you have a full working solution on that.
I was going to ask you a question on this. So, obviously this is really common, like you said, for things like store locators and things along those lines. How would this, and like maybe you don't have the answer to this, but how would this, you say, compare, I guess, to using it as a native app in maybe like an iPhone or an Android? Because, so you mentioned geolocation, when we're going to touch on shortly, notifications and also the clipboard APIs, and they feel very sort of native app to me, vanilla app, if you will. And so like, this is obviously something, these are sort of more advanced APIs that the browser has gotten for either niche cases or just to expand its ability for PWAs and for, use cases that we've already described. Like, what's your thought on this? Like this, just to me, like personally, this feels very like, hey, like you could do this on the web, but you kind of should do it natively. I don't have like a technical reason for that. It just feels like that to me.
Well, it depends how intricate you want to get to it. Like there's some limitations on a web implementations of some of these things. Like the performance of your app might suffer a little bit if you're loading in a really big map and you're live dynamically showing people. Like there's a reason why Google Maps, Uber, and those things are actually native applications. They're not web views wrapped, because you need that extra performance. But for simple stuff like a store locator, there's no reason that it shouldn't be on the web. Like the get current position definitely gives you enough to tell the person what general vicinity they're in and show the stores that are located around that general vicinity. You know what I mean? Like the other part of it is like, does your device have a GPS in it? Does it not? Are you using IP-based geolocation? Are you using, like there's different ways to get a current position. And depending on what you're using, like I'm using a desktop computer right now, it doesn't have a GPS. So my current position is going to be slightly different than my actual position, because it doesn't know exactly what part of the building I'm in and stuff like that. It just knows my IP and knows where my IP is located. But if you're on a phone and you do the get current position, it's going to try to use GPS, and it's going to give you a more accurate position. And then it's going to be just like a native app where you have a more, refined experience.
Okay, yeah. So like this is very much the reason why something like Pokemon Go or something, I mean, Uber, like you mentioned, things that need sort of continual map integration, they generally won't be on the browser. I mean, Google Maps is in the browser, like it will do some stuff, but it's definitely going to be a bit of a different, if not more limited experience than it would be if you, say, had an Android phone and just booted up the app from there.
Yeah, and it's nothing to do with the geolocation API in those cases. It's just to do with how performant you can make those apps. Like Pokemon Go requires a lot of 3D graphics, requires, a constant active connection, requires et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a lot of features packed into it, plus a 3D engine on top of that. So the map is just kind of a side thing in Pokemon Go. The other stuff is what makes it actually more complicated to do in a browser. Not impossible, I should say, but like way more difficult than it should be. So that's why it would be a native application.
Like if you did it, it would be more for like, hey, we made Pokemon Go in the browser as a proof of concept, but download our app.
Yeah, it would be more that, exactly, because it would be tougher to maintain. Like, yeah, you just wouldn't do it. Okay, next one here is notifications API. So this one,
this is my dad's favorite API. I'll let you know.
Is it really?
I'll let you know why after all this.
Okay, cool. Okay, good. So in a lot of cases on the browser, if you go to like a blog website nowadays, it'll show up with another, again, little user permissions bubble asking you, do you want to enable push notifications on the browser for this specific website? And you can, decline or accept or whatever. If you accept, what that means is that even if you're not on that website and a push notification gets sent to the push notification server of that website, it'll actually come into your browser almost like a native notification, I should say. And this is the notifications API that is, enabled by the browsers and allows you to show messages with a title and a body. Nothing too complicated. I think you can do some sort of action on those messages and stuff like that. These messages are not something you can really style because they're determined by the user's computer, pretty much. Like it'll show up, like a push notification on Chrome on Windows will show up in the Windows notifications panel. And that is obviously styled by Windows more than anything else. So you're just kind of sending information to something and getting that to the user. Yeah, I don't like, there's just not much, like, I don't enable them 99% of the time. The only time I would enable them is for like a productivity application or a chat application. Like if I'm using the web app of Telegram, for instance, and I don't have it on my phone for whatever reason, I'll enable the push notifications on my computer, and then it's going to act like a regular chat app, chat web app.
And to give some context to my previous statement, my dad is not a developer. He's a millwright, and he just like would read news, go to different websites. He does like woodworking and stuff on the side, and he would just click allow to get the pop-up to go away on every single one of these websites. And he did not have a smartphone, and he eventually did get a smartphone, and his phone was going off like an executive that was trying to like put out a major investment fire or something, investor fire. And I was like, what's going on? And I go to his phone, and he had about one notification every 1 to 3 minutes that was coming in from like 1,000 websites. Like it was absolutely ridiculous. And then to make matters worse, I fixed this. Like I went in and killed all this because like he said he wanted them, but he wasn't using them. So I think I don't know what he was asking me for. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to turn these off. And then like if he asks for them again, we'll just turn them back on, turn them all off. And then his computer got a virus, which turned on about 14,000 notifications. So it came back, and I was like, at first I was thinking to myself, well, why the heck is this, like, that he turned them back on? Like, what happened? And no, he just got a virus, gave him about 14,000 notifications, and it was about one every minute. Not one every 1 to 3 minutes, about one every minute or less. And it was everything you could possibly think of. It was the most like scatterbrained virus malware you'd ever think of. It wasn't like, yo, we're gonna like, try to convince you to vote for Biden or something. It was like absolutely everything from like, yo, this kid did a really cool trick on this scooter, to, hey man, vote for Biden. Yo, bro, don't like Trudeau. Hey man, have you heard that Germany has a cool road? Like it was absolutely everything. And my thought went out to who made this and why? Because, I mean, if like the German road, I guess, is paying you as well as the cool kickflip on a scooter, but then like who's paying you? What's happening? Like,
there's just ads on those pages. So they're trying to get people to visit those pages to get more click-throughs on their ads. That's literally all it is. It's really a dumb, stupid, antiquated thing from the web that I hope dies with the utilization of AI summarization.
Or Mike,
Sad,
you would never know about that kid's sweet trick on a scooter.
Oh, of course, yeah. I would love to know about more about that. Send over that malware so that I can learn about that one cool trick.
Should you vote for Biden is the question, even though that doesn't really apply right now. Have you heard of Germany's cool ass road? Which I assume would probably be the Autobahn, but that's not what the headline said. Just a dumb app. It's a dumb malware. But yeah, so that is my dad's favorite API out of the group of these. And I've disabled it in the browser. Like I've disabled notifications in the browser at the browser level, so that's it. It's over.
Yeah, and this one's a little bit like controversial in the sense that I think on Safari on the phone, it doesn't work. Like you can't get an Apple device to subscribe to a push notification, which limits PWAs, for instance.
That's fascinating.
PWAs, yeah, I'm pretty sure that that's the case. Something that we could verify, but this is the thing with like Safari's fight against PWAs was that they don't want the PWA apps to act exactly like native applications to bastardize their store. So one of the things that they limited, among others, was the notifications API, so that if you wanted to send push notifications, you needed to be a native applications on iOS.
I did ask ChatGPT here, and it says that it does work on Apple mobile devices, specifically like obviously iOS. However, there's limited support. So I'll just read a couple points. Limited support on iOS for notifications. Notification API is not fully supported on iOS Safari. While this is changing gradually, notifications on iOS have historically been restricted, and support is usually handled through native apps or specific PWA installations. And so it says here for PWAs, which I'll mention here, and there's more information, but I'll just read these two. So PWAs notifications on iOS, specifically iOS version 16.4 and above. So as of that version, 16.4, Safari on iOS began supporting push notifications for PWAs that have been added to the home screen. This is a significant update as it enables web apps to send notifications in a manner similar to native apps, but it's limited to PWAs saved to the home screen specifically, and it requires user permission. I'll be honest, that's not bad. That's not too bad.
I like that. Yeah, I like that. I think that totally makes sense, where if someone is intentionally adding it to their home screen, then they probably are okay with receiving it. And that additional like accept notifications prompt is good too. Because like, again, 99% of the time, I don't want these notifications. So I defer to no. But in a few instances, again, if there's a web app that does good notificate, like web app for chatting or whatever, like web app for news even, that I really am interested in, then I'll enable it. But it's very case by case basis. So I'm glad that they've bent on that one.
And you can actually access the iOS notification system, but you have to use like a framework, like a hybrid app. So something like a Cordova, like Apache Cordova, or like React Native, it says here as well.
Yeah. Cool. So that's notifications. There's another one called Clipboard API. This one is very direct. So Clipboard is referencing your ability to check what people have copy pasted and to allow people to copy paste with the press of a button. So if you've ever been on a page where it's showing like code blocks and there's a little clipboard button next to a code block and you press that and it copies the code block, that's using the Clipboard API very specifically. You might use it to intercept someone's pasting as well. So if someone is pasting something, there's an event on the clipboard where you can take it and sanitize it. Like, for instance, you don't want people to be able to paste into like an OTP code, for instance. You only want an OTP code to contain numbers and letters. So what you do is you take what people are pasting, strip everything but numbers or whatever into the input box, and then people can pretty much copy an entire email, paste it, and it'll still work in OTP if you intercept that. It kind of like intercept the paste command, essentially, the paste event. So there's a lot of use cases of the Clipboard API that you can do. I've seen someone mention that like a right-click context menu on a logo, for instance. Say you have a logo on your website and you want people to be able to easily copy the SVG of that logo. You can add a context menu. So that's another actually web API. There's a context menu web API where you can create a custom one. And on the right click of that logo, open up a custom context menu and show an ability to copy SVG for that logo. And what that will do is literally use the Clipboard API to write text to the clipboard, and the text would just be the code of the SVG. So really cool use cases that you can use all over the place with Clipboard API. I think it's underused a little bit. It also is something that you have to be careful of because a lot of people will copy paste their passwords and stuff into clipboards. And then a malicious website, what they can do is go into your clipboard, read your clipboard history, and steal your password. So there are a lot of mitigations for that. A lot of password managers, for instance, as soon as you copy and paste something, they'll clear your clipboard. They'll detect the clear. They'll detect the paste, and then they'll clear it. And then they also have like a limitation on how long they'll store your password into your clipboard because of these kinds of malicious attacks that could happen based on the Clipboard API across different devices.
I've used the Clipboard API. I believe that's how I did it. It's been a while to copy the link for, if you go to our blog, you can like click the thing.
Yep.
but I have no feedback. So you just click it, it just doesn't do anything. Like it's literally like I did an MVP, shipped it, and then I've gotten quite a few emails. People are like, "Is this like it worked?" But like you probably should tell me that it copied. I'm just sort of like, "Yeah, I'll get to it." It's been like it's been several years. I'm pretty sure that's what I did. It was the clipboard API, unless I did something really hacky. But that's my exposure, if it was exposure to the clipboard API.
That sounds about right. Yeah, like, I've definitely done that where I left it in a half-assed state and been like, I don't want to deal with this. But yeah, so that's the clipboard API. I think one thing I've mentioned it, but like the get user media API is really important. I've used it a ton. Again, get user media refers to getting people's input and output devices on their computer. So input device would be, cameras and microphones and stuff like that. Output device, I have no idea. I guess a printer. I'm not sure if get user media gets printers. I could be bullshitting there, but that'd be
not even proper printer drivers get printers. So there's that.
Yeah, so it's probably not the case. So let's just go input devices. Get user media does input devices, and that allows you, again, ask for the camera and do crazy things like display the camera in a canvas, do filters on top of that camera, do any sort of face verification stuff if you want to do it, do fun video chatting with WebRTC API as well. Like there's a lot you can actually combine these APIs and do on top of each other, which is really interesting. So get user media, definitely one that I've used a ton. I guess an output device would be a speaker. Now that I talk about it.
Yeah, an output device would be a speaker, could be like some other generic potential API or a output device like a light bar or something, maybe something along those lines.
Yeah, I don't know what you would do with a speaker with the get user media other than detect that someone has speakers, maybe. That is a possibility.
When you're in like a Google Meet, would it be something like when you can select your output device? Like, do I want it to be output to my headphones or my speakers if there's two different interfaces?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. So like you can choose which output device to talk to, or detect if someone has a speaker and blast a Sailor Moon theme song.
All right.
Whatever you want to do. Whatever you want to do.
These are UX boosting APIs. This is the section of this episode is UX boosting. You're just like Sailor Moon, full blast, let's go.
Let's go. But yeah, so that's a really cool user experience boosting API for sure. Let's move on to APIs that improve performance and connectivity. So big one off the top here, Service Worker API. This is probably, I'm gonna make a bold statement. This is the most complex API in web development. And there's multiple reasons for that. Yeah, there's multiple reasons for that. This is the thing that's going to be in charge of creating your PWA. This is the thing that's going to be in charge of creating parallelization in your application, like running multiple features or functions at once, which is, not typically what JavaScript is known for, but with service workers, it's possible. This is the thing that's going to allow you to use their other languages like Rust and stuff like that to improve the performance of your application. And service workers are going to handle a lot of your caching stuff. And all of those things that I said are probably the most complicated parts of web development to get separately, and together having one thing that's in charge of them is obviously an abstraction that makes things very powerful. Service Worker makes the web extremely powerful. And a lot of these massive websites that seem like they're way too big to be run on the web, stuff like Figma, stuff like Linear, stuff like Todoist, all of those are very heavily utilizing stuff like service workers, whether it be to parallelize their app, whether it be to, again, offload some computation to separate threads using service workers, or again, offline mode using caching to do a lot of the offline mode stuff. That's what service workers are. There's a lot more that they can do. I believe we have an old episode where I go more deeply into them, but I haven't touched them in a little while. They are, out of this list, for sure, most complicated. But again, if you're going on your web development journey and you're learning all these web APIs, service workers would probably be the last thing you learn, because that's going to be the thing that sinks the most amount of your time, and you need to learn them when you need them. It's one of those things where to build a simple web application, even if it's used by thousands and thousands of users, you probably aren't going to need to touch service workers a lot of times. It's when you need to enhance the performance of that application, or add offline mode, or PWA that application, which all of that stuff can be done. It's just a little bit more complicated. The next thing here is the Network Information API. This one's pretty important, actually. So if you're building something like a site that's streaming video, or you're building a site that has a lot of media on it, like a lot of pictures and stuff like that, that heavy load on a user's network can be a detrimental experience to that user. The Network Information API allows you to essentially check what the speed of a network is that the person that's connecting to your website is using. Right? So if someone is using 3G on their phone, you'll know that their speed is going to be low. And you can get more granular than that even. So you can check like if they're intermittent and all that, but you can detect the type of network and you can detect the speed of the network. And this is going to help you very drastically serve better content that is more fitting of a person's network speed to a user. So if they're, for instance, on 3G, you can serve them a 480p video. And if they're, for instance, on 4G, you can serve them a 1080p video. Or if they're on 5G, 4K, whatever. Like you can change the speed, the bandwidth of their video and the quality of your video based on the network speed. And the same thing goes for images. If you have 100 images that you're loading because you're a magazine website, maybe on a low network speed, you load the text and then load like 10 images and change the way your images load. Maybe the compression on your images changes, whatever, so that you're serving to people that can handle it really high quality images to people that can't, lower quality images. So you can vary a person's experience and performance on your website based on their actual ability to consume the data on your website.
I just did a quick little search on this because I didn't actually know this existed, but this is super cool. And one of the things that I'm reading here is that you can actually check if someone has set the connection to metered as well. And you could say like serve different images or maybe not autoplay a video and have, maybe a facade load first or something like that. That's fascinating. I'm actually going to try this thing out. This sounds really cool because I did not know this was possible. The thing that sucks about this from an agency perspective is that, well, there's two perspectives. So when you're working at an agency and you're working on a project for somebody, there's the client perspective and there's your perspective. The problem with something like this, and the cool part about something like this is, from a technical perspective, this is really cool. You can completely tailor the experience and try to make it so, like, let's just say your load time is 1 second. That's your goal. You can make your load time great all the way from, say, 4G to 3G or slow 2G or whatever it is, right? That the person has at the time. The thing is that the user, meaning the client, may not realize that their website will look different and may, especially if they're very picky about what loads, they may sort of freak out and be like, oh my God, like, why isn't this video auto-playing? While they go to check it while they're in like a rural area on their phone. So I could see this being super cool, but immediately my thought is the amount of meetings and conversations and texts and calls where we're like, why is this slider not loading? Why I don't load the slider unless they have 4G? Pain in the ass. But like for something for us, like, or something for me, like this is super cool. I did not know this existed.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're right. Like a lot of edge casey stuff can piss people off. A lot of times how that's handled is like maybe showing a banner saying like, hey, you're using this in low performance mode or low network, so your experience might change and stuff like that. And maybe being like, if you want to use it in regular mode, click this button, but it'll load slowly. Like, and then just, flipping a switch, flipping a boolean.
Well, what's interesting about this too is that there are so many times where I've been doing something. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's a golf example, but I'll give you an example. I was at the Canadian Open and there was a spot, just a very particular spot, because the Canadian Open was hosted in the middle of the city. At a golf course, to be clear, but in the middle of the city. And there was like one little spot where it just really just wasn't loading well. The data had a little bit of a dead zone. And I was trying to load the PGA website to see who was coming up on the tee, like a nerd. And basically, I couldn't load that page. But I'm thinking to myself, a lot of stuff was loading. Like there was a Rolex ad or something, and there was all this other crap. Like if they really wanted me to know who was at that tee, you could probably, having not used this myself, you could probably make it so it only loads the table in a condition like that, and in a network condition like that, and then it would just show me like a basic text table instead of showing me the flashy PGA website. But so many websites, and I'm not blaming this on the PGA, so many websites, including all of the ones I've ever built, don't do that. because it's probably because, like, imagine the communication of being like, hey, by the way, like, your website's going to look like garbage if the person's connection's garbage. And they're probably like, no, I want my brand to look good. That conversation's going to be super weird. But I mean, for a web app, especially if it's something behind closed doors and you know that the connection might be garbage and you like, it's something like an inventory of parts for a millwright or something, that would be super good to be like, yo, if you have good speed, like maybe we'll load our logo. If it don't have good speed, it'll just load it in plain text or something like that. This is interesting. I've never like the gears are turning. I've never heard of this thing, but it's pretty cool.
There's one more thing you could do actually is there's a network information API, but there's also a hardware API where you can detect the amount of cores that someone has. And so like you can detect how many cores are running on their computer and actually like serve that. If they have only one core, then you know they're running on a piece of shit, and serve them, you know, a less intensive website. Depending on the web app you have, that might be useful. So there's multiple layers of this, of these APIs that could go. And there's like, I'm looking at the developers.mozilla.org, like the MDN web docs. I've covered what, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like around 9 or 10 APIs. I'm currently like going through a list of them right here. There is, I don't even know how many, like probably 50, 60, something like that. A lot of them are experimental, I want to be clear. And again, mentioning experimental APIs, those are not APIs. Those are APIs that are just like one browser has adopted to test out, and then other browsers might adopt, might not. So you can't really use them in a production application.
Could be behind a flag too, like even like if maybe
exactly.
Firefox grabbed it, but it's not even really they grabbed it fully. They grabbed it and it's behind a flag.
Exactly. Like there's just a bunch of different caveats to an experimental API, but like there's so many other ones that I did not mention in this episode, and I highly recommend you go through them, especially if you're building something in a little bit more of a little bit more interactive way, or you're building something that's a little bit outside the box. For instance, picture-in-picture. There's an API for doing picture-in-picture mode on videos, right? Like that's a super cool little feature that you don't have to build yourself, like, you know, custom building a little video player app that you can drag around the page. No, you can just use the picture-in-picture API to pop out your video, and then people can browse around on different pages and still watch a video that's on your website. Like there's a bunch of ones that I did not cover that I wish I had the time to cover that are very cool. But again, the point of this episode is, first of all, to make you aware that there are web APIs, and I will add a link to the list of web APIs that are available, including the experimental ones, to the episode's resources. So that's one thing. The other part of this episode is that it's important to kind of demystify or separate the line of, hey, this is a web API. This is built into a browser and you consume it, versus this is a JavaScript API that's built into JavaScript. So for instance, array functionality, like doing a map and a filter, that's JavaScript APIs. That's not a web API. You can use arrays and filters anywhere that runs JavaScript, including the backend, including the front end, including wherever the heck you want to run on the space shuttle. It doesn't matter. If it runs JavaScript, you're able to do some array filtering. With stuff like the media, the capture, like, you know, the get user media API, that's only going to work in the browser. You can't do that anywhere else. So again, it's an important separation to make. When you learn these kinds of separations, it's easier for you to, first of all, find the right tool for the job. And second of all, debug when something goes wrong. Because if you're trying to debug JavaScript and you think that, you know, get user media or DOM content loaded is a JavaScript issue versus a browser issue, it becomes confusing. I've run into this issue when I was first kind of starting to learn backend, when I was first starting to learn servers. I did a DOM content loaded in there and everything blew up because there's no DOM. But I couldn't picture that. I didn't understand how that's possible, because I'm like, this is built into JavaScript. Like I was always writing this in JavaScript, but it's not. It's built into the browsers. So yeah, that's I really want to make that point. It's an important one, but yeah, these are the core APIs. Again, tons more that are really cool to look at.
And the sheer number of APIs just like really kind of highlights why it's good to do a quick Google search or even ask an AI quickly, because you just mentioned like you could build like your own little custom video component, which is picture in picture, or you could use, you know, the proper picture in picture thing if it exists, right? And like this goes to other use cases as well, right? Like you might try to do some crazy thing where you're like, let's quickly transfer a video, and then I'll like check how quickly it transferred or fetched, and then I'll grab the speed that I think the browser is, and then it's like, or you could use the network information API, right? So it's like, it's always good to do a quick check and just be like, hey, am I doing this in the proper way? Because it's very easy, especially if you know what you're doing with, you know, DOM manipulation and JavaScript, of course. It's very easy to just be like, hey, I'm going to make this little custom video thing. Hey, I'm going to go and do this like quick, you know, image transfer thing to figure out the network speed, when that maybe is an antiquated way to do it, or, you know, there's a better, you know, built-in way to do it.
Yep. That's exactly it. I think overall we've covered the core, but we've just touched the surface. That's it. And yeah, I'm hoping you're going to play around. If you have any APIs that you are particularly fond of and that we did not cover and you think are part of the core, please let us know. I am at HTML Everything on Twitter, at HTML Things on Instagram, wherever you want to reach out to us. There's going to be a way to contact us, but we especially like any sort of questions, or even if you have something that we said wrong. Any time that we say something wrong, we'll probably put a disclaimer in our show notes. And yeah, that's all.
And in the show notes as well, we'll include a couple of cutting edge APIs to watch out for in 2024, including one where you can actually like detect faces, like it's shape detection. So it'll like look for barcodes or look for, you know, shapes and that type of thing. I'll include that, just like a little brief description if someone's reading through the show notes, as well as the WebXR API, which is more for augmented and virtual reality experiences, which we did mention very briefly in the beginning of the episode. Just we'll add a bit more context in there, just a bit of purpose, potential applications and implementation. We'll include those in the show notes as well. But I think that's it. Unless you have anything else to add, Mike, I think we can run the old conclusion.
Runner up.
Alrighty, well, remember that you can support episodes like this on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML, all the things. Like many of these, or like these fine people did. These are our $3 tier patrons. Tried to change the script and it didn't sound good, so I'm just not going to change that next time probably. But anyway, our $3 tier patrons, Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mosteler from the website swoonworthydesigns.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off. Wait, it won't sign us off until we give Michael Araka his shout out. That's Michael Araka. He's a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. He's the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. And now we're signing out, and you're free to leave or don't listen to the outro. You decide.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.